The first time in probably about 6 visits to this church that I've actually managed to be at a service on time. So thank you for your patience up until now. I want to read a few verses from Matthew 6. We're thinking overall about the issue of going deeper with God, developing our relationship with God, becoming more intimate with Him. And I want to focus this morning on the issue of prayer. And then in the session after lunch, we'll think a bit about Bible study and how we get into His Word and allow it to impact us. And no passage when it comes to prayer is more telling for me than Matthew 6, where Jesus just speaks very much from the heart. I don't know how you see the Gospels. When I went to study theology at college, most of my lectures seemed to be absorbed with the Pauline epistles. Huge theology there. And I guess I always thought that the high watermark of biblical studies was to get into the Pauline epistles or maybe some of the Old Testament prophetic books. But in my old age, I've just got back to the Gospels, which have been so fresh and exciting and invigorating. And I find in particular the words of Jesus so piercing, absolutely piercing. It's difficult even to read them without feeling a sense of emotion because of the utter purity of what He says and the purity of response that's demanded from what Jesus says. So I've determined in my old age as a Christian to just read the Gospels every year. I try to read the Bible every year. I don't always succeed. But make sure I read the Gospels every year and just listen to Jesus again and be entranced by Him. At Matthew 6. It's a fairly long section, but we'll just take the time to read and think about, again, how His disciples must have felt as they listened to these words, given their context, as they listened to these words. Verse 5. Now, when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in synagogues and in street corners, that they can be seen by others. But truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, don't heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, because they think that because there are many words, God will hear them. Don't be like that. For your Father knows what you need, even before you ask Him. And pray like this. Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we've also forgiven those who have a debt against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others who trespass, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others who trespass, then neither will your Father forgive you. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting might be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they've received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. That's all I want to read just for now. I had the disadvantage of going to church long before I became a Christian. And I say it was a disadvantage because I was pretty cynical as a young person. And every time I went to church, and my church wasn't the most exciting of places to be at, every time I went to church, I went looking for some reason to condemn or to criticize or to look down on the folk who were there. And I have to say, I did find reasons for doing so, albeit I did all this from a very, very cynical angle, not liking Christians, even though my parents were that, and not wanting to appreciate or admire them. And I remember one day that made an indelible impression on my mind, and I still remember this very vividly. I was probably about 15 years old at the time. And I sat in church. We had these hard pews, not very comfy. And I sat directly behind one of these guys who was a patriarchal figure in the church. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't like church, but I had enough now to know this guy was where I was at. He's the kind of person you have to have huge respect for, because being a patriarch, he is not to be disobeyed or disagreed with ever. And it was in a breaking of bread service when this old man got up to pray. Now, I have to say, prayers tended to be a bit of a vigil in my church. I don't know why they had to be so long, but they were. And it was only the comic books I smuggled inside my King James Bible that helped me see through the whole service in the first place. But he got up to pray, and right next to him was his grandson in my church, which is a good practice, by the way. The kids all had to come to communion, unless they were very, very young. We do that in my church now. It's a good thing to do. His grandson was sitting there, and being probably 5 years of age, he couldn't concentrate. So rather than sitting facing the front, as we all did in these pews, he was up on his haunches like this and looking at all the folk who were, well, all the facial expressions. But the thing I noticed was this, that as his grandfather went through this lengthy prayer, the wee boy was mouthing every single word, for minute after minute after minute after minute. And it occurred to me, though I wasn't even a Christian, that what was coming out from the mouth of this old man was not some fresh cry of excitement towards God, but a bit of a tired old liturgy, which had been thrown out week after week after week after week, ad nauseum, ad infinitum, to the point where his 5-year-old grandson had memorized every single word. And I thought to myself, well, if that's prayer, why should I bother becoming a Christian and getting into that kind of stuff? It is utterly devoid of any kind of meaning. I then became a Christian at the age of 17 and entered into this whole new world, an exciting new world for me, where one of the things that was part and parcel of everyday life for us as Christians was to pray. And I could see the sense in prayer. I understood from my own parents how important prayer was. They had been missionaries, and without prayer they would not have survived their 23 years in Ethiopia. I could see the sense in prayer, but I already had this negative image of prayer because of the meaningless liturgies I had grown up to spectate. And communication was never my strong point, so what do I do about this? But I decided that, like everything else in the Christian life, you just got to get into it. I didn't become a Christian in some kind of casual way. I was very serious about being a Christian. I was really serious about following God. So I thought I'd apply that same kind of seriousness to my prayer life. And it became a bit of a grotesque vigil for me. I don't know if you ever did this. Maybe I'm unusual. Well, I probably am unusual in lots of different ways. But I decided that I would launch into these prayer marathons to really prove my extreme piety. And it was exhausting and frustrating in equal measure. I remember one night deciding, because I'd heard a missionary report where this missionary talked about praying all night and calling out to God, and he made reference to Nehemiah and all these great men of prayer in the Old Testament. I thought, I'm going to do this. And so I went into my room with a genuine intention, and it was genuine, of trying to really wrestle with God. And I had made notes of all the stuff I wanted to pray about, a whole list of things that I knew were urgent matters that I needed to bring to God. And I had a glass of water there in a bottle because I knew I'd be there all night. And I had a few snacks because I needed to sustain myself. Mars bars is a wonderful way of keeping yourself going in a prayer vigil. And it was 10 o'clock and I thought, I'm going to keep going till probably 7 or 8 in the morning. So I got down, I began to pray. To help myself concentrate, I began to speak out loud. My folks must have thought I'd lost my marbles, mumbling away in the next room. I was praying and praying away, and after the exhaustion began to hit my body, I thought to myself, well, it must be the early hours by now. So I looked at my watch and it was 10:43. And I was incredibly discouraged. And I thought, well, what I need to do is to put more energy, more effort into this thing. Love the Lord your God, as we thought last night, with all of your strength. So I'm going to do press-ups and sit-ups. I'm going to practice staying awake late at night so I can have the physical energy, the alertness, the attentiveness to keep going at this and make sure I break my own personal records. And prayer became a wee bit like when I did jogging or mountain climbing or played football. You get to that point of tiredness and you put that extra wee bit of energy in because you're determined to make sure you do this better. And I guess prayer became all about me and what I could achieve, and not about what Jesus intended prayer to be. And I found it very frustrating because as a young Christian, I desperately wanted to love God and to serve Him and to be the kind of Christian that would please Him and that He could take pleasure in. But this one huge area of my life was such an utter failure. I just had no idea where I was going. And in desperation, and maybe desperation isn't a bad emotion to feel, and this isn't a bad thing to do when you get into desperation. In desperation, I just went back and began to listen to Jesus. And not try to theologize prayer too much. While the theology is important, we talked last night about loving God with our minds, and I think theology is desperately important for spiritual growth. Desperately important. But not try to theologize too much, but just listen to what Jesus had to say. And that brought me to Matthew 6, which I've read hundreds of times now in my life. And every time I read it, it just sounds so fresh and so relevant and so pertinent to where I'm at. What strikes me about Matthew 6 and about Jesus' teaching in general is that much of his teaching was done to the whole crowd. Some of his teaching he focused particularly on his intimate group of disciples. And one of the things that he kept talking to his intimate group of disciples about was the issue of prayer. He was coaching them. It strikes me, by the way, that I was never coached in prayer. You become a Christian and you're just expected to get on with it. And nobody ever takes you aside and says to you, why don't you come and pray with me? And I longed just to have somebody who really knew God in a way that I didn't, just to invite me around to their house for a cup of coffee and just to pray together. Just to pray, nothing else, just praying together. I never had that coaching. Jesus gave that coaching to his disciples. Not to fill their minds with theology, though much of his teaching was deeply theological, but just to help them get over this huge hurdle, which is an impediment to many of our lives as we try to grow spiritually, this barrier of just learning what prayer should be all about. And so he took this time in very simple ways just to teach his disciples, to coach them in what prayer should be about. It strikes me as I look at these words that the most important thing that Jesus said, the most important thing was his opening phrase. When you pray, say, Father. And actually it still thrills me. But it struck me with incredible reality that even if that one phrase I could genuinely take on board and own for myself, then I'd make huge strides in my walk with God. Because it helped me to move from seeing prayer as some grim vigil that you have to work your way through with all of your energy, to just seeing it actually as a hugely natural relationship. Now, many of us come from backgrounds where we either haven't had a father figure, at least a good father figure, maybe not a father figure at all. Or there have been some reasons why our relationship with our father has been difficult. I was one of those kids who, I was an irritant to my entire family. Certainly up until I got saved, and probably afterwards as well. But during my whole teenage years, it was awful. It was awful. The stress I put my parents under was unforgivable. And the relationship it most affected was with my father. Because as the authority figure, and he was an authority figure, as the authority figure in the house, I spent 5 or 6 years in my teenage years just having one long, constant battle. A battle of wits, a battle of the wills, a constant clash. And I guess his fatherhood was in a sense defined by trying to control some of the excesses of my lifestyle. But whatever your experience of fatherhood is. We all intuitively know how big a deal it is to have a father, to have that relationship, to be a father. I have 3 children, and I'm the natural father of one of them. I'm the adoptive father of the other 2, and I love them more than my own life. I can't think of anything in my life that's more significant than my kids. I would do anything for them. And if I'm away, for example, on a weekend like this, and I go back, my first thought is not to switch on the television or to indulge myself in some hobby, but just to see my kids again. And if you're a parent, you know what that's like. It's a wonderful relationship, and they feel that way about me. And I took my oldest girl out to friends last night, or just before I came down here yesterday evening, and she was in a strop. I don't know if it's just a girl thing, by the way, but she was in a serious strop. If this has been recorded, by the way, I hope it never gets into YouTube or the website, because I'm dead. She was in a huge strop with me, and it was a rant all the way there. And then after I dropped her off, she texted me just to apologize for the rant. But did I get upset about it? Well, not really. It doesn't really bother me if she's in a mood. She's my daughter. And as her dad, I'm there just to hear her and to listen to what she has to say. And even if it's anger being expressed, or frustration, or sadness, or joy, or a thank you, or not a thank you, it makes no difference to me, because I'm her dad and she's my daughter, and I just love to hear her voice. And there is that connection you have with your kids, or you have with your parents. I do have that now with my dad. My mum she died a number of years ago, and I really miss her, because I always had that relationship with her, where it's just so utterly natural and so utterly real. We were in Wales last week seeing my wife's dad, and looking after him for a few days. And on one of the days, we just went down to a beach. South Wales coast has beautiful beaches. It's a lovely, lovely place to go. They live in the valleys not too far from the coast. And just walking along the beach with my kids, we didn't actually say anything. We walked for about a mile, I guess, didn't say a word. But it didn't take away from the meaningfulness of just being together and just knowing that they're there. And the difference for me between that experience and had I just walked along the beach on my own, I can't even express how different that feels. And for them as well, whether or not words are uttered, those non-verbal cues, just looking around, that glance, that smile. And all of those things are rolled up in this incredible word, Father, which I think is one of the most beautiful words in the entire English language, or any language. And Jesus said, when you pray, the very first thing you've got to say when you pray is Father. Now, how far away is that from a kind of a dead liturgy, or a formula that we feel we have to utter? I remember on one occasion being told, I was told off, actually, I took part in a communion service. And I was told off because, and if I'm being insensitive to some of your cultural backgrounds, please forgive me. I don't mean to be insensitive. It just comes naturally. I was told off because I did not pray using terms thee and thou. And I tried once to pray using that terminology, and I failed utterly, and I gave up. And I thought, I'm not convinced this is what Jesus was trying to say. Actually, I asked the question, is there a Greek version of thee and thou? Of course, there isn't. But we develop these approaches to prayer, some of which are helpful because they do aid concentration. But those approaches don't ring true with the term Father, which is about a real and living relationship with somebody who utterly loves us unconditionally, whatever our mood, and just wants to hear us speak whatever it is that we say. That liberated me. I told you last night that sometimes I get angry with God, and I do. I got very angry with God when my mother developed a serious mental illness, which she had for all of my life. And I got quite upset and frustrated, having prayed for her healing for years. And then she died at the age of 56. That was a frustration, if ever there was one. The one person in all the world that I felt I had an absolute connection with as a human being. And she was gone. And she was the greatest Christian I have ever known. And gone. And I got angry. I wouldn't want to tell you what I said to God. But he was a father. And not put off by expressions of anger that come through, because, well, that's what a relationship is all about. Now, if we learn nothing more than just understanding God as Father, that is enough to really help us to take great strides in our walk with Him. And if we cannot say Father with all that term means, then we might as well be orphans. And how do you get anywhere spiritually if you don't have a dad? Now, having encouraged the disciples just to use that term and to use it freely and with joy, Jesus then goes on to say, hallowed be your name. And that is an important reminder that there does need to be an attitude of recognition of who God is. And that almost sounds a confusion, doesn't it? A contradiction in terms, because here are two opposites juxtaposed. This idea of Father and relationship and intimacy. And then that sense of the awesomeness, the holiness of God. How do we bring those two? Which God are we praying to? Are we praying to the God who's accessible and immediate and only a prayer away or a sentence away? Or are we praying to a God who's mysterious and awesome and transcendent and great and glorious? Which God do we talk to? Actually, we talk to both, because they are one and the same God. And we need to be careful in all of these areas where you have seeming opposites being brought together in Christian theology, that we don't drift into one area or the other. If you become too absorbed with the transcendence of God, while His transcendence is very real, you might lose sight of the intimacy of relationship we have with Him. And if we focus too much on the intimacy that we have with God, we can lose sight of the fact that He, every moment of every day, sustains this entire vast universe. And without His active sustenance, the entire thing would just implode. And life as we know it would come to an end in an instant. And it's capturing both those things, but in the context of a relationship. When I went to boarding school in Ethiopia, I was sent there to learn English, and some wealthy Ethiopians also went to the boarding school for their English to be developed as well. And one boy in my class was a boy called Isaac Selassie. Interesting character. The day he turned up at school was quite an intriguing day, because first of all, a military jeep turned up at the boarding school with shoulders jumping out. And then this enormous big Range Rover with darkened windows. And a uniformed man jumped out of the Range Rover and opened the doors. And this wee boy jumps down from this Range Rover and begins to walk over to the classroom, with bodyguards standing outside the classroom door all day long while he was in class. It was because Isaac Selassie was the grandson of the Emperor Haile Selassie, who had not only been the head, when he was alive, of the longest royal dynasty on earth. The Ethiopian royal family goes back for centuries before our royal family. But he is also seen amongst African leaders as the statesman for all of Africa. Africa House is in Addis Ababa. Ethiopia was the one non-colonized African country, so Haile Selassie was the patriarchal figure for all Africans. And a man who, of course, is worshipped by the Rastafarians as God. And what struck me was that for Isaac Selassie, his grandson, he was perfectly well aware that Haile Selassie was the great emperor of Ethiopia and had been the head of the Abyssinian Empire, and his family had been for hundreds of generations. He was aware of that, but he was also the old man who would sit in his bed and tell him bedtime stories and then kiss him in the forehead and say good night. Those two things can coalesce. And part of the mystery and the beauty of prayer is remembering that our Father is great, and that great God is our Father, and those two things come together, and they are natural partners. They're not opposites. They come together as we talk to him. Then in verse 10, Jesus goes on to say, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we're almost tempted to think that he's now launching into a lesson in theology. He's now talking about the sovereignty of God and how the sovereignty of God works itself out in the world as he sustains the world and imposes his rule. But Jesus isn't talking about that at all. He is still talking about prayer. He's coaching his disciples to develop a real living relationship with God. So whatever he means by your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, it's not a lesson in theology, it's a lesson in how we relate to God. What does that relationship look like in practice? God is utterly sovereign. Even though he permits some aspects of his creation to be in disobedience. The vote that took place in Parliament recently on gay marriage, I'm quite sure God has an opinion. I also know that he could determine what he wills, but he chooses to allow disobedience. One of the intriguing things about the world that we live in, a God who is utterly sovereign allows rebellion and still loves those who rebel. That's a conundrum. But one of the reasons why God allows rebellion, even though he is utterly sovereign and can, at the click of a divine finger, wipe out the entire universe, one of the reasons why he allows rebellion is because he wants us, as his children, to freely choose to obey. Now, next time you get upset or complain about the mess the world is in, just think of how much God values your obedience. God allows the world to be in an utter mess so he can take pleasure in you as an individual obeying his will. Now, in heaven, God's will is absolutely obeyed, without question. And Jesus said that when you pray, your will be done here on earth, in my life, in people around me, just as it's done in heaven. Prayer is an act of submission. We understand, as we relate to God, as we get to know him, we understand what he wants. My wife and I do a fair bit of talking. And when you talk to somebody and you chat away about stuff, you get to know all their idiosyncrasies. You get to know their likes and dislikes. It's one of the joys of being married. It's what makes marriage an adventure. You continue to find lots of bad stuff that you don't appreciate in your partner, and they find the same thing with you. You also find lots of good stuff as well, and you get to know what they like. My wife and I did a Mr. and Mrs. a number of years ago, and I got one up because I got all my questions correct. The first one was, what would your wife most like? Breakfast in bed, or you to cook the dinner for her, or a bunch of roses? It's cooking the dinner for her, always. Got it right. And I do stuff like that occasionally just because it's what she enjoys. A relationship is all about give and take, and it cannot be healthy unless there's that willingness to identify what my husband or wife likes and wants, and willingly delivering that thing because of love. Now, that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. He's not speculating on the extent of the sovereignty of God. What he's saying is, if you want to have a real relationship with God, if you want your relationship with God to grow deeper, then just learn the art of just saying to God, yeah, I'll do it. Every day, God convicts me about something. And I know, either intuitively or because I do know what his revealed will says, I know exactly what God wants. And simply to say, yes, I'll go along with it. I'll do that. That's what keeps the relationship fresh and real and powerful. And when we stop that surrender, or we hold part of our lives separate, then we stop our spiritual growth. And this whole process of discipleship and getting to know God and to love him just grinds to a halt. I was hugely challenged recently by my wife because I tried desperately hard to sanctify different areas of my life. And there was one area that I wasn't sanctifying, and she identified that. And she said to me, it doesn't matter what you do. If you can't hold that over to God, then it'll all stop. Spiritual growth will come to an end because God knows that you're holding back. That's what Jesus was talking about here. Your kingdom come. It's here in our hearts. It's present here in this world. And your will be done. God, we want to say yes to you. And whatever you ask of me, I want to do it. And reminding God day by day, God, I'll do it. Now, of course, God knows all things. But if God didn't want to hear us speak, then why have prayer in the first place? So much of prayer is just saying to God every day, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it. That's fine. God, I'll agree to that. I'll go with that. I'll deliver. You might say, but surely prayer is also about asking for stuff. Well, yes, it is. Interestingly enough, though, in this particular prayer, Jesus didn't have very much request as part of the component of what we call the Lord's Prayer. He did talk in other places about asking for things and how God will deliver when we ask in his name. We haven't time to look into that this morning, but that's a whole area that's worth exploring. But he does mention 3 requests here that he encourages us, he coaches us to ask. But again, it's all in the context of our relationship with God and keeping that relationship real and vital and healthy. Give us this day our daily bread. There's absolutely nothing wrong with asking God for stuff, provided our motive isn't greed. I will fairly soon need a new car. Why not ask God? Does God begrudge me? I'm not being greedy. I need a car. Does God begrudge me? Not at all. Asking is an entirely valid thing. But what Jesus specifically speaks of here is in our prayer life, and don't think of prayer as a formula, think of it as a conversation, this relationship that we have with God. This, relationship is the best word I can possibly think of. He's talking here about that sense of just learning to depend on God. Every day I rely on him. Now, that's not easy in our society because, first of all, we have the kind of very driven society where we all want to look after ourselves. And we've got our career paths all planned out and whatnot. And we encourage our kids to study hard at school. I'm doing that with my daughter at the moment because she begins university, hopefully, in the summer. And get their degree and get a good job and make sure you can care for your family. It's part of our DNA, part of our thinking. And of course, if we don't rely on ourselves, we learn to rely on the state. Why do I need to depend on God? Because after all, David Cameron and George Osborne provide all my needs. And we can lose that sense that we actually do depend on God. Habakkuk in chapter 2, verse 4 said that the just will live by faith. And when we think about the life of faith, we often think about, for example, missionaries who live by faith out in the mission field. But they're not the only ones who are just. We're all just if we're Christians. And living by faith should be the practice for all of us, irrespective of whether you have a paid job or not. That's irrelevant. To just live by faith. And we need to recognize that utter dependence that we have on God. You have a career. God has given it to you. Don't think for 1 minute that it's a sheer coincidence that you have that job. It's a gift from God. And if God had not been so generous, you would not have had that career. Tell you what I find intriguing. We teach our kids to say grace at meal times. Good thing to do. I had to get used to a Western way of doing things because in Ethiopia you say grace after the meal. Once you've had your fill, then you give thanks for the food. A bit smarter, actually, if it's really been worth giving thanks for. But anyway, that aside, we teach our kids to give thanks for their food. Maybe we should be teaching our kids to give thanks for their trainers. Or the new t-shirt they've just bought. Or that they have school to go to. Don't always appreciate it, but it's a huge privilege. I took my daughter to the A&E the other day because she broke her finger. And as we sat there with the sign coming up, 4-hour waiting list, I was just about to complain, but I turned to Taylor and I said, we need to thank God that God has given us this great privilege. It is a gift from Him. All good things come from the Father, says James. It's all gifts from God. And it's practicing that sense of dependence and learning to trust and rely on Him for other things that aren't within our control. Every day living by faith and trusting God that this day will work out because God is utterly sovereign. He is our Father and He's caring for us. If we lose sight of that dependence on God and our desperate need to have God as a reality in our lives for everything that we do, let's not divide the secular from the sacred. Let's not divide Sundays from every day of the week. That's not biblical. That's Greek philosophical thinking, impregnating evangelicalism. It's heretical thinking. Every day of the week belongs to God. Every aspect of our lives belongs to God and is a gift from Him. And we need to learn that sense of dependence because that's how a child gets to love their parent. Because my Father is the person who loves me and cares for me every day of my life. Then Jesus goes on to say, after talking about living trustingly, forgive us our debts as we also forgive our debtors, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. 2 requests that are very much linked to the whole issue of forgiveness, actually, and sin and offense. Forgive our debts, forgive our sins, our mistakes, the things that we've done wrong, the times that we've screwed up. Well, of course we know, because it's part of our evangelical DNA, that we ought to confess our sins, and He's faithful and just and will forgive us our sins. However, it's not just some kind of ritual. It's about having a real relationship with God. When I was a kid, one of the issues I really struggled with was habitual lying. And for years, I would tell porcupines to my parents all the time. It drove them mad. I made up all kinds of stories, some of which, by the way, they believe, which shows the level of their gullibility. And they were entirely taken in. I got away for whole weekends thinking I was going to stay with some old granny who's a deeply devout Christian, when it was no such situation. And I had to come to the point where I not just deal with that sin, but deal with it for the sake of that relationship, because the relationship is just falling apart. Lying isn't such a big issue these days, but there are other issues. And actually, the older I get, I discover new issues that begin to develop. I thought years ago that once I get older and more mature as a Christian, then sin won't be such a big issue. It becomes a big issue. It just becomes different sins. The sin I'm now praying very much that I don't fall into, because I see it in lots of people, and I don't want to inflict it on my kids, is the sin of just becoming a grumpy old person. It's a great sin. And it discourages young people in churches right across the country. One of the issues about sin is it affects our relationship with God. When Jesus was telling us to come and to confess our sins, obviously it's not about salvation. And it's not just about purity, though purity is an issue here. It's about the effect that my sin has on my relationship with my Father, who gets so upset, whose heart breaks when he sees me as his child, who he's redeemed with the precious blood of Jesus, and I sin and don't seem to care about it. And just saying prayer is a way of practicing confession. Confession is good for the soul. It's very good for our relationship with the Father. Coming to God every day and saying, God, I'm sorry. I've done it again, and I'm really sorry about that. And just being real about genuinely feeling sorrow for the kind of lives that we've lived. As we forgive others. Now, you notice that, by the way. Jesus went on to say, if you do not forgive others, then your Heavenly Father will not forgive you. How's that for a smack in the chops? There are some people I'm enormously resentful about. And probably you are too. Some of them are actually in church. Some of the deepest wounds that we get are from other folk in church. Ever noticed that? And we can be deeply broken, deeply bruised, deeply hurt. I talk to Christians who have been destroyed because of what's going on in church. And they haven't forgiven. It's appalling. Utterly appalling when you think of all that we have been forgiven. But we're still, in their refusal to forgive, their spiritual growth grinds to a halt. Because how can we experience intimacy with the Father when He willingly forgives us and we are still embittered towards other people? Nowhere is godliness more manifest, more evidently seen than when we forgive others, especially other people in the family of God. I feel deeply pained about this at the moment because I have several Christian friends at the moment who hate each other. And there are reasons for it, and there's a context to it. They hate each other. Some of them are actually in Christian ministry. They hate each other. And my fear is, and I say this with humility because God knows my heart and my utter failings. My fear is that soon they will have nothing else to give to people because their own walk with God will be stunted by a lack of forgiveness. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. A friend of mine once said to me that he thinks we as Christians almost innately press that self-destruct button. And we do it time and time again as we yield to the temptations that the devil throws at us. And yes, he is a hugely powerful enemy. And one of the reasons we need to grasp is one of the reasons why the devil is so insistent on tempting us and getting us to sin is because he knows that drives a wedge between us and the Father. And the devil wants to do anything in his power to prevent the Father from feeling pleasure from his children. It's all about relationship. And so Jesus pleads with us to pray and find strength against temptation because that will stop that intimacy. It'll stop that enjoyment of a deep relationship with God. So deal with temptation. Resist the devil. Not just so the devil can flee from you, but so the Father can run towards you. And you can enjoy a depth of relationship because you're saying no to sin and you're living that life of holiness and purity as you walk with God. Notice that this whole prayer is not just about the technique of asking for stuff and then getting those things delivered because God is all powerful. It's all about coming to God as Father and having a real relationship. And prayer is simply an expression of a real relationship. That's all it is. It's not a formula. It's not something that we write down and utter. It's just talking in the context of a relationship with somebody who we deeply love and who loves us unconditionally. Then Jesus goes on to talk about fasting. And he does warn us about making it too much of a show. What literally did happen was that the religious leaders of his day would put flour in their faces to make them look more pale, and would loudly boast that they were fasting. And people would admire them because they look so gaunt and terrible. So, what a pious guy you must be. I think we have, in our current generation, gone to the opposite extreme by not fasting at all. I have a men's group in my church, and I encourage this group of guys, when we come together to pray, to discuss the Bible. We do it late at night because we're all family men. I encourage them that from the night before they are to fast. So when we come together for prayer together as a group of guys, we are genuinely focused because of the fasting we've been doing. I was distraught at how few guys were prepared to fast, and ashamed of how few guys had ever even considered fasting. And yet the Bible's full of it. And I asked the guys, well, why is it that you're not fasting? And they gave me lots of reasons. Well, it's just a bit of a ritual, isn't it? Yeah, but why did Jesus do it? Was Jesus just a ritual junkie? Not at all. It has to be something more to it than that. Well, I don't really understand what fasting is about. Well, why not read what Jesus has to say? Because he says lots about fasting. Someone else said, well, I don't really have the discipline to fast for a whole day or 24 hours. I couldn't believe that. That is astonishing. Now, if it's actually true, you have more problems than you realize. You're a pathetic individual. But I suspect it's only an excuse. Or one guy said to me, I don't have enough big issues in my life to pray about to warrant fasting. I was astonished by that. I said to him, well, let me just give you a wee thing to think about. There are at the moment roughly 5 billion people on this planet who are going to hell. Start there. The truth is that most of us don't fast for one very simple reason. We like food. It's as simple as that. We like food. And to give up our dinner, well, couldn't possibly do that. I know Jesus died on the cross for me, but giving up my dinner, that's an awful big ask. It's as simple as that. Now, we're not to make some kind of ritual. I used to go through the same kind of thing with fasting that I did with prayer. I would try a 3-day fast. Now, look at me. I struggle to maintain my 9 stone 12. I keep telling my wife and my PA, they don't get very happy with this, that we're going to meet in the middle. They're losing weight and I'm gaining weight, and hopefully sometime our weights will more or less match. For some reason, they're upset by those comments. Anyway, this 3-day vigil, and I really struggled. I found myself getting really quite weak. It's not that kind of a thing at all. It's just a simple putting aside of a very natural, normal thing to help me focus better on God. And it seems to me that there are massive benefits to fasting. Let me just run through a few of them. It does add strength to our prayers. These things will happen, said Jesus in Mark 9:29, through prayer and fasting. That focus that it gives to our prayers, it adds real strength. We can somehow hear God's voice better. We hear our rumbling stomachs as well. But somehow when we take the deliberate time to give ourselves to the act of prayer, not just practicing the presence of God in everything, which we should do all the time anyway, but focused times of prayer and fasting, it does enable us to really think through and to focus on God and to experience Him. I think it demonstrates commitment. If you are not prepared to give up food for 24 hours, I know some folk can't do so for health reasons, but if you're not prepared to give up food for 24 hours, just to redeem that time in your busy life and to get that focus just to be with God and have some intense experience of Him, then questions need to be asked about our spiritual lives and to what extent we really do love God with our strength. We thought about that last night. It's also an expression of love. God, I love steak and turkey and curry. Best food in the world is Injera, it's Ethiopian. I love that. But I'm not going to have dinner today because I love you more. And spending those moments with you is more significant to me than having that brilliant meal. And there are spiritual blessings. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, I think it's fasting Jesus is talking about, for righteousness. Prayer is such a vital part of our spiritual growth. Praying naturally, in your car, when you're in the shower, when you're going for a walk, practicing God's presence. We don't have to turn it into a ritual or a formula. But not just praying naturally, taking time to pray with real intentionality. Maybe locking yourself away. For me, it's going up mountains. I love just being up there, just with God, lying on the ground, crying out to Him, wishing to have reality in my Christian life. If prayer does not become that real and living and vivid part of our Christian lives, then Christian growth will grow to a halt. We've talked a lot about prayer. I'm conscious that we haven't been doing much. So let's just take a bit of time before the band come back up and just pray. I don't know what you want to talk to God about. That's between you and Him. It really doesn't matter. And whether you want to do it quietly or talk out loud, even if there are 50 folk praying out loud at the same time, what difference does that make? God hears all of our voices. And if you want to stand or kneel, if that comes easier to you, or walk around, I find walking helps me. I go for lengthy walks with the dog as well. It kills two birds with one stone. But pray as I walk around the streets in my area. But let's just spend some time talking to God. He is Father. He's Father. I'm not going to tell you what to talk about. That's between you and Him. But let's just spend a few moments talking to God and bring Him into our time together, because He loves us intimately and wants to be part of this. So let's just spend some time talking to God, and then in a few minutes the praise band will come up.